Something is breaking down right now at the highest levels of global diplomacy, and I want you to understand exactly what it is, why it matters, and what it tells us about where this war is actually heading. Because what I am going to walk you through in the next few minutes is not a story about another failed summit or another round of diplomatic language that goes nowhere. This is a story about a peace process that has been collapsing in slow motion for months, and the events of the last 72 hours have now brought that collapse into full public view. The ceasefire that the world has been waiting for is further away tonight than at almost any point since this war began. And the reason for that, the factual, documented, verifiable reason, comes down to one man's decisions and one government's refusal to compromise on anything that matters. Stay with me, because the full picture is more complicated and more consequential than any single headline is telling you. Let me take you back to where this story actually starts, because to understand why the peace talks are in crisis today, on the 1st of June 2026, you need to understand the entire diplomatic arc that brought us here. When Donald Trump returned to the White House in January 2025, he made ending the war in Ukraine a signature foreign policy priority. His special envoy, Keith Kellogg, was dispatched almost immediately with a stated goal of brokering an agreement within 100 days. That deadline came and went without a ceasefire. Then came the trilateral talks in Abu Dhabi in late January and February 2026, the first formal negotiations involving American intermediaries since the early weeks of the full-scale invasion. No breakthrough. Then Geneva in February, described by Al Jazeera's own correspondent as producing no breakthrough and no breakdown. An outcome that sounds like progress but is actually a sophisticated description of nothing. Through all of this time, the Trump administration gave Ukraine and Russia an explicit deadline. Zelenskyy told reporters directly, paraphrasing his own words accurately, that the Americans are proposing the parties end the war by the beginning of summer and will do everything to make that happen. That deadline is June 2026. That deadline is right now, and the war is still going. The missiles are still flying, and Putin has not moved a single centimeter from the demands he laid out when he sent his tanks across the border in February 2022. Here is what Russia's position actually requires, and I want you to hear this clearly because the media coverage often buries the specific details under layers of diplomatic language. When Russia's delegation sat down at the Istanbul talks in May and June 2025, the first direct face-to-face negotiations in 3 years, they presented a memorandum that was not a compromise. It was a list of maximalist demands dressed up as a starting point. Russia offered Ukraine a choice between two options for a 30-day ceasefire. Option 1 was that Ukraine must withdraw its forces from the Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson regions, which Russia illegally annexed in September 2022 but never fully captured. These are not regions Russia controls. These are regions Russia claims on paper while Ukrainian soldiers still defend significant portions of them. Option 2 involved conditions equally unacceptable to Kyiv. Both options required Ukraine to abandon its NATO membership aspirations entirely and permanently. And underlying all of it was the phrase that has appeared in every Russian diplomatic communication since this war began, the demand to address the root causes of the conflict. In the Kremlin's language, root causes means Ukraine's existence as a sovereign Western-oriented state must be permanently constrained. That is not a peace proposal. That is a surrender document with extra steps, and Zelenskyy said so. He told reporters, and I'm paraphrasing accurately, that Russia insists on Ukraine giving up territories and that Ukraine is fighting precisely to prevent that from happening. He said, "We of course do not want to give anything away. That is exactly what we are fighting for." Now let me take you to the Istanbul talks themselves, because what happened there was revealing in a way that went beyond the substance of the proposals. The first round of talks in May 2025 was the first time Ukrainian and Russian officials had sat across a table from each other since March 2022. 3 years of silence broken by a meeting that lasted barely 2 hours and produced nothing except an agreement to exchange prisoners of war, which both sides had already indicated they wanted anyway. Then the second round on June 2nd of 2025 in Istanbul again, and by this point expectations were already so low that the failure barely registered as a surprise. Both sides exchanged their memorandums, which sounds like progress. What it actually revealed was that the two sides' red lines are not just incompatible at the edges, they are mutually exclusive at the core. Russia's head of delegation, Vladimir Medinsky, a former culture minister with what one analyst accurately described as a penchant for historical revisionism, made the Russian position plain. And then Dmitry Medvedev, Russia's former president who now serves on its Security Council, removed any remaining ambiguity. He wrote publicly, and I'm paraphrasing his statement, that the Istanbul talks are not for reaching a compromise peace but for ensuring Russia's swift victory and the complete destruction of what he called the current Ukrainian government. That is a member of Russia's Security Council telling the world in writing that Russia's negotiating team went to Istanbul not to negotiate but to delay while Russia prosecutes the war. This is not my characterization. This is Medvedev in his own words. And if you want to understand why the June 2026 deadline has now collapsed without producing a deal, you need to hold that statement in your mind as the key that unlocks everything else. Now let me tell you what Russia has been doing on the battlefield while the diplomats have been talking, because the military and diplomatic dimensions of this crisis are inseparable. In early May 2026, with peace talks technically still ongoing and with Trump administration intermediaries still shuttling between capitals, something happened that crystallized the fundamental problem with taking Russian diplomatic signals at face value. Russia and Ukraine both declared competing ceasefires around the Victory Day celebrations of May 9th. Russia announced a pause in military operations for the holiday. Ukraine said it would halt fire starting May 6th. And then, within hours of Russia's own declared ceasefire period, Russian forces launched a barrage of 108 combat drones and 3 missiles at Ukrainian cities. Ukraine's foreign minister said it publicly and on the record, Russia violated its own ceasefire. This is not a he said, she said situation. These are documented weapons impacts on Ukrainian cities during a period when Russia's own government had announced a halt in hostilities. Zelenskyy said directly, paraphrasing his words accurately, that this attack was a reminder to the world that Russia rejects a ceasefire and chooses killing. And then came May 24th, which I covered in detail previously. 600 drones and 90 missiles in a single night against Kyiv. Every district of the capital struck. 30 residential buildings damaged or destroyed. A school hit. The Chernobyl Museum hit. The Ukrainian cabinet building hit. The foreign ministry damaged. And Russia's deployment of the Oreshnik, a hypersonic ballistic missile that is nuclear capable, against a European capital city. This happened while a June peace deadline was on the diplomatic table. This happened while Trump's envoys were working the phones. This happened while European leaders were publicly calling for an immediate, unconditional 30-day ceasefire. Putin's answer to the June deadline, to the American pressure, to the European calls, to the Ukrainian willingness to pause hostilities, was to fire 600 drones and 90 missiles at a civilian capital in a single night. And now, as of June 1, 2026, here is where the peace process actually stands. After more than a year of renewed diplomatic effort since Trump took office, after Abu Dhabi, after Geneva, after Istanbul Round 1, after Istanbul Round 2, after a June deadline set by the world's most powerful government, there is no ceasefire. There is no framework agreement. There is no agreed set of principles. There is no scheduled next meeting. There are only Russia's bombs still falling on Ukrainian cities and a gap between the two sides' positions that is not narrowed by a single meaningful degree. The Atlantic Council put the strategic reality in terms that every policymaker in Washington and Brussels needs to hear. Even if Putin did not believe that military victory was on the horizon, he would be highly unlikely to risk a compromise peace involving limited territorial gains. What that means in plain English is this: Putin is not negotiating in bad faith because he thinks he is about to lose. Putin is not negotiating in bad faith because he is desperate. Putin is not at the table to make a deal. He is at the table because refusing to show up would cost him something politically with Trump, and that cost is lower than the cost of actually compromising. He is playing out a process while continuing a war, and he has been doing this for over a year, while the diplomatic community has been generating summits and deadlines and memorandums that produce nothing except the appearance of process. Now let me tell you about the pressure that is building in Washington, because the political dynamics inside the United States have shifted in ways that matter for how this crisis resolves or fails to resolve. Senator Lindsey Graham of South Carolina has been working for months on what he has publicly called bone-crushing sanctions legislation targeting Russia. He introduced the Sanctioning Russia Act of 2025, together with Senator Richard Blumenthal, a Democrat from Connecticut. The bill has accumulated 84 co-sponsors in the United States Senate. 84 senators from both parties, more than enough for a decisive majority, have agreed to put their names on legislation that would impose secondary tariffs on any country purchasing Russian oil, gas, uranium, or other key commodities. What that means in practice is that China, India, Brazil, and every other nation currently buying discounted Russian energy to keep Kremlin war revenues flowing would face American economic penalties for doing so. Graham went to Kyiv personally and told reporters directly before departing that he doubted the Istanbul talks would amount to more than what he called a Russian charade, and that he had spoken with Trump before the trip, and the president expects concrete actions from Moscow. In January 2026, after a meeting with Trump, Graham announced publicly that Trump had greenlit the bipartisan Russia sanctions bill. He said Ukraine was making concessions for peace, while Putin was all talk and continuing to kill the innocent. He said the bill would give Trump tremendous leverage against China, India, and Brazil to stop buying the cheap Russian oil that provides financing for what he called Putin's bloodbath against Ukraine. This is a Republican senator, one of the most hawkish voices on foreign policy in the United States Senate, publicly calling out the president of Russia by name with language that would have seemed extraordinary just a few years ago. And the reason that matters is that the Graham-Blumenthal sanctions bill represents a potential breaking point in the diplomatic stalemate. If Trump actually allows that legislation to move forward and the secondary tariffs kick in against Chinese and Indian buyers of Russian oil, the economic pressure on Moscow becomes qualitatively different from anything that has been applied so far. Russia's oil revenues, already under serious pressure from Ukraine's drone campaign against refineries, would face a simultaneous diplomatic and legal squeeze from the United States that the Kremlin has not yet had to manage. The question that nobody in the diplomatic community can answer with confidence tonight is whether Trump will actually pull that trigger. Because the same president who greenlit the sanctions bill also spent months trying to broker a deal with Putin through direct calls and back-channel contacts. The same president who said he wants the war over by summer has also expressed frustration with both sides and suggested at various points that he does not want to waste his time on meetings that go nowhere. There is a genuine tension inside the Trump administration between the impulse to disengage from a costly and complicated European conflict and the impulse to demonstrate that American pressure can achieve what other approaches could not. And Putin has been brilliantly, if brutally, exploiting that tension for over a year. He talks about memorandums. He proposes talks. He accepts temporary pauses on specific categories of attacks when Trump asks him personally. He creates just enough appearance of engagement to prevent the full weight of American diplomatic and economic pressure from landing on Moscow. And then he fires 600 drones at Kyiv, and the talks continue, and the deadline passes, and nothing changes. Let me give you Zelenskyy's position, because it has evolved in ways that deserve serious attention and that the media often oversimplifies. Ukraine agreed in March 2025 to an immediate, unconditional 30-day ceasefire. That was a genuine concession. Ukraine accepted the American proposal with no preconditions attached. Russia refused. Ukraine has been willing to discuss territorial arrangements that would be subject to a national referendum, acknowledging the political impossibility of Zelenskyy personally signing away sovereign Ukrainian land without popular approval. Ukraine has engaged every format, every venue, every intermediary that has been proposed. It went to Istanbul when many of Zelenskyy's advisors were skeptical it would produce anything. It sent a high-level delegation, including its defense minister. It prepared and transmitted a peace memorandum. It has done, in procedural terms, everything that a country genuinely seeking a negotiated settlement is expected to do. And every single time, Russia has responded with new maximalist demands, new conditions, new preconditions for the preconditions, and new barrages of missiles and drones targeting Ukrainian cities. Zelenskyy was explicit about what the core impasse is. He said, using his own words, paraphrased accurately, that the most difficult point is the territory question. That Russia demands Ukraine leave Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhzhia, and Kherson, and that this is something the Ukrainian people and their president cannot accept. He proposed that any territorial arrangements be submitted to a 60-day referendum process so that the Ukrainian people, not their president under American pressure, make the decision. Russia refused to accept even that framework. Here's what I want you to understand about what a genuine versus a performative peace negotiation looks like. A genuine negotiation involves both parties accepting that they will end up with less than their maximum position. Both parties making concrete, verifiable concessions on things that actually matter. both parties restraining military operations to demonstrate good faith, and both parties giving their negotiating counterparts enough political space to sell a compromise at home. Russia has done none of these things. In every round of talks, Moscow has repackaged its opening position as its final position. It has continued and in May 2026 dramatically escalated its military campaign while talks were ongoing. It has refused to accept even a temporary unconditional ceasefire. It has rejected direct talks between Putin and Zelenskyy, with Putin saying he would only meet Zelenskyy in the final phase of negotiations, which is a way of saying never, because there can be no final phase without the preliminary phases first producing something. And its public communications, from Medvedev to Lavrov to Putin himself, consistently frame the war's conclusion not as a negotiated settlement, but as the fulfillment of Russia's original stated goals, which include removing the current Ukrainian government and installing one that accepts permanent Russian dominance. That is not diplomacy. That is the announcement of a maximalist war aim dressed in the language of a peace process. And the June deadline has now passed into history as yet another failed milestone in a string of failed milestones. Now, I want to give you the honest strategic assessment of where this leaves the war and what the realistic paths forward actually look like. Because there are people watching this who want simple answers, and there are no simple answers to this. There are three possible trajectories from this moment. The first is that the Trump administration concludes that Putin is not negotiating in good faith and moves the Russia sanctions bill forward with real force, imposing secondary tariffs on Russian energy buyers and dramatically tightening the economic pressure on Moscow. If that happens, combined with continued Ukrainian drone strikes on Russian oil infrastructure, the cumulative economic pressure on Russia becomes something qualitatively different from anything applied so far. Russia's refinery capacity is already at a 16-year low. Its export revenues have taken $1 billion hit in a single week. If Chinese and Indian buyers of Russian oil suddenly face American secondary tariffs, the Kremlin's financial position deteriorates faster than any battlefield development could achieve. That is the scenario in which economic pressure becomes a genuine accelerant toward a different negotiating dynamic. The second trajectory is that the diplomatic process continues in its current form indefinitely, with periodic rounds of talks that produce prisoner exchanges and nothing else, while the war continues at its current intensity or escalates further. Putin has demonstrated clearly that he is willing to sustain this process for as long as the cost of doing so remains lower than the cost of making real concessions. If the sanctions bill stalls, if American pressure does not materialize in concrete economic form, if European unity begins to fray, then Putin's calculation remains unchanged, and the war continues into 2027 and potentially beyond. The third trajectory, and this is the one that NATO defense planners are most concerned about, is that Russia interprets the failure of the June deadline as a signal that it can continue escalating without meaningful consequences and increases the intensity of its military campaign further. The May 24th Kyiv attack was the largest aerial assault on the capital in the entire four-year war. If Putin reads Western inaction on the peace process as a green light to escalate further, the next attack could be larger. The Oreshnik has now been used against a European capital city 3 times. Russia's drone campaign has already caused a NATO member state's citizens to be physically injured on their own soil. The escalation runway, as dangerous as that phrase is to contemplate, is not yet exhausted. Let me close with what I believe to be the most important thing to understand about this moment. Peace in this war requires Russia to accept less than its maximalist goals. Everything else, all the formats, all the venues, all the intermediaries, all the deadlines, is secondary to that single fundamental requirement. Until there is a mechanism that makes continuing the war more costly to Putin personally and to the Russian state economically than accepting a settlement that leaves Ukraine sovereign and independent, the diplomatic process will continue to produce the same result. More meetings, more memorandums, more missed deadlines, more missiles falling on Kyiv. The June deadline is gone. The July deadline, if one gets set, will go the same way unless something changes in the underlying cost-benefit calculation that Vladimir Putin is running every morning in the Kremlin. Ukraine has shown its people can endure. Its military has held against a force that military planners expected would achieve its goals in weeks. Its drone program has reached deep into Russia and hit the economic machinery that funds the war. Its diplomatic engagement has been consistent and serious. What has not changed is the Kremlin's assessment that it can win more by fighting than by settling. And until that assessment changes, the peace talks will remain exactly what they are tonight. A crisis with no resolution in sight. Watch the sanctions bill. Watch whether Trump enforces the economic pressure he has said is necessary. Watch what happens to Russian oil revenues in the next 30 days. Because the battlefield and the boardroom are connected in this war in ways that no previous European conflict has demonstrated so clearly. And the fires burning in Russian refineries are connected to the ice that has settled over the diplomats' tables in Istanbul and Geneva and Abu Dhabi. Ukraine is fighting this war in every domain available to it. The question is whether the West has the patience and the will to apply pressure in the domains that matter most before the next June deadline becomes the one that finally breaks something. The war is not ending, but the terms on which it might eventually end are being written right now, in the decisions being made in Washington, Brussels, and Moscow tonight.